Before we begin tonight's journey through history's most expensive foods, we need to understand one simple truth. For most people in the past, the biggest question was not, what's for dinner? It was, will there be enough? Today, many of us can walk into a grocery store and choose between dozens of kinds of bread, fresh fruit from around the world, frozen meals, spices from faraway places, and snacks that fill entire aisles. We might complain if our favorite brand is sold out. We might even stand in front of the refrigerator, wondering what sounds good. For most of history, that would have sounded like a very strange problem to have. Imagine waking up in a small village sometime during the Middle Ages. The sun has only just climbed over the fields. There is no coffee waiting for you, no refrigerator humming in the corner, no supermarket just down the road. Breakfast is probably yesterday's bread. If you're lucky, it is still soft enough to chew. If you're less lucky, it has become so hard that it needs to be soaked in broth or water before anyone can eat it without risking a broken tooth. Medieval bread could be surprisingly tough. Dentists, thankfully, were not nearly as common as tough bread. For many families, bread was more than just one part of the meal. It was the meal. Most ordinary people depended on grains like wheat, rye, barley, or oats. These grains became bread, porridge, or thick soups that filled empty stomachs. They were simple, cheap, at least when harvests were good, and they could keep people alive through long winters. The word salary might make you think about money, but food was often just as important as coins. A poor family might spend almost everything they earned simply buying enough grain to survive. There was very little left for anything fancy. Vegetables helped stretch meals a little further. Cabbages, onions, beans, peas, carrots, turnips, and leeks appeared over and over again on ordinary tables. They grew well in local soil and could often survive rough weather better than delicate crops. If dinner looked suspiciously similar every evening, no one was surprised. It was simply how life worked. Meat, however, was another story. Many people imagine medieval villages filled with roasting chickens and giant legs of meat cooking over fires. Reality was much quieter. Most farm animals were worth much more alive than eaten. A cow gave milk. A chicken laid eggs. A sheep provided wool. Even pigs were valuable because they represented future meals, not today's dinner. Killing an animal was usually saved for special times. A wedding, a festival, a religious holiday, or perhaps when an animal had become too old to be useful. Fresh meat was not something most families expected every week. Sometimes not even every month. Fish could replace meat in places near rivers or the sea, but inland villages often had fewer choices. Preserving fish with salt helped, but salt itself could be expensive, as we'll discover later. In many homes, the cooking pot was always busy. Whatever happened to be available went inside. A handful of beans, some onions, bits of cabbage, perhaps a little barley, maybe a few herbs gathered from nearby fields. Nothing was wasted. Even stale bread could be broken apart and added to soup. The result was not always exciting, but excitement was not really the goal. The goal was making it to tomorrow, and tomorrow looked very much like today. Life also depended heavily on the weather. A single season of heavy rain could ruin grain fields. Too little rain could be just as dangerous. One late frost might destroy fruit trees. A swarm of insects could eat months of hard work in only a few days. Modern farmers have machines, weather forecasts, fertilizers, and many ways to protect crops. People hundreds of years ago mostly had hope. Sometimes hope was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. When harvest failed, everything changed. Bread became smaller. Soup became thinner. People searched forests for nuts, berries, mushrooms, and edible plants. Families carefully measured every remaining sack of grain. Parents often ate less so children could eat more. History is full of stories of communities surviving on whatever they could find. Tree bark was sometimes mixed into flour. Wild grasses became meals. Acorns were ground into rough bread after long preparation. None of these foods were delicious. They were simply better than eating nothing. This constant worry about food shaped almost every part of daily life. Work began early because crops needed care. Children learned farming from a young age. Entire villages worked together during harvest season because every hour mattered. Losing part of the crop could mean months of hunger. Food was not just something people enjoyed. It was security. It was survival. It was life itself. That is one reason luxury foods became so important. When nearly everyone struggled to eat enough, anyone who could afford rare spices, rich desserts, fine wines, or exotic fruits immediately stood apart. Their meals announced something before they even took the first bite. I have more than enough. A noble's table might include roasted game covered in imported spices. A merchant could serve sweet cakes made with expensive sugar. A king might enjoy fruits that had traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles. Meanwhile, just outside the castle walls, ordinary people dipped coarse bread into simple vegetable stew. The difference was impossible to miss. Food became a way of showing power. In fact, some grand feasts were almost like public performances. Guests admired dishes before tasting them. Bright colors, rare ingredients, and unusual flavors impressed visitors as much as castles, fine clothing, or expensive jewelry. Sometimes a meal was meant to say, "Look how rich I am." It was history's version of posting a picture of an incredibly fancy dinner online. Except instead of collecting likes, you were reminding everyone that your kitchen budget was larger than some villages. Not every rich person ate extravagantly every day, of course. Even wealthy households followed seasons, dealt with spoiled food, and faced difficult harvests. But compared to ordinary workers, their choices were almost endless. That gap between ordinary meals and luxury foods is the heart of our story. Every spice, every sweet dessert, every rare fruit, every costly piece of meat that we will explore in the chapters ahead only became valuable because most people could never dream of buying them. To understand why pepper could be worth a fortune, why sugar was once locked away like treasure, why saffron was treated almost like gold, or why a simple orange could make someone stare in amazement, we first needed to understand a world where hunger was never very far away. Because before history was filled with famous feasts and royal banquets, it was filled with ordinary people hoping the next loaf of bread would last just a little longer. And with that quiet thought, our journey into history's most expensive foods can finally begin. Now that we know how simple everyday meals could be, let's meet one of history's smallest treasures. It isn't made of gold. It doesn't sparkle in the sunlight. It can't be worn as jewelry. In fact, if one tiny black peppercorn rolled across your kitchen floor today, you might not even bother picking it up. 1,000 years ago, someone probably would have. That little black bead came from a climbing vine growing thousands of miles away along the warm, tropical coast of India. To the people who harvested it, pepper was simply another crop, but by the time it reached the tables of Europe, it had become something close to magic. Its journey was long, very long. Imagine holding a single peppercorn in your hand. Before it could season a rich person's dinner, it might have traveled farther than most medieval people would travel in their entire lives. It began in green forests where pepper vines wrapped themselves around tall trees. Farmers waited patiently until the berries were ready to harvest. The berries were picked by hand, spread out under the hot sun, and slowly dried. As they shrank, they turned into familiar wrinkled black peppercorns we know today. That part was the easy job. Getting them to Europe was another story. Merchants packed sacks of pepper onto ships crossing the Indian Ocean. Others loaded them onto long camel caravans that crept across deserts. The spice changed hands again and again. Every trader wanted to earn a little profit. By the time the pepper finally reached Europe, dozens of people had already made money from it, and every one of them added a little more to the price. The journey itself was full of danger. Storms could sink ships without warning. Pirates searched busy trade routes, hoping to capture valuable cargo. Bandits watched lonely roads where merchant caravans slowly crossed mountains and deserts. Even if everyone survived, there was still disease, accidents, broken wagons, spoiled supplies, and political wars that could suddenly close important trade routes. Every successful delivery felt almost like a miracle. No wonder pepper became expensive. In fact, it became so valuable that people sometimes called it black gold. Unlike actual gold, however, pepper had one very useful advantage. You could sprinkle it on your dinner, although perhaps only a tiny sprinkle. No one wanted to waste it. Rich households often stored pepper carefully inside locked chests. The person responsible for the family's spices held an important position. Expensive seasonings were treated almost like precious jewels. Imagine inviting guests to dinner. The servants arrive carrying roasted meat. Then, with careful hands, someone adds a pinch of freshly ground pepper. The guests notice. They know exactly what it means. This family can afford imported spice. This family has connections. This family has wealth. The flavor was certainly enjoyable, but the message was just as important. Pepper announced success before anyone even tasted the food. Some wealthy merchants even accepted pepper instead of money. It sounds unusual today, but pepper held real value. It could pay debts. It could settle rent. It could be given as a gift between important people. In some places, written records mention taxes or payments made partly with peppercorns. Imagine your landlord saying, "That will be 42 peppercorns, please." It sounds like something from a fairy tale, but history can be wonderfully strange. Of course, ordinary people knew what pepper was. Many had seen it in markets. Some may have smelled it while walking past the kitchens of castles or wealthy homes. Actually, buying it was another matter. For a peasant earning just enough to feed a family, spending precious coins on imported spice made little sense. Bread came first. Grain came first. Firewood came first. Everything needed for survival came first. Pepper belonged to another world. Instead, ordinary cooks flavored meals with herbs growing close to home. Parsley, sage, thyme, mint, rosemary. These herbs could be grown in small gardens or gathered nearby. They added pleasant flavors without requiring dangerous sea voyages across half the world. No pirates needed to be involved. That was certainly a bonus. Still, the wealthy wanted more than local herbs. Foreign spices carried an air of mystery. Many Europeans had never seen India. Some barely understood where these spices came from. Stories about distant lands grew larger with every retelling. Some believed pepper grew in valleys guarded by dangerous snakes. Others imagined impossible forests filled with strange creatures protecting valuable plants. The truth was much less dramatic. Pepper farmers were simply doing their jobs. But mystery often made expensive goods seem even more valuable. Medieval cooks used pepper in ways that might surprise us today. Modern recipes often use it gently. A little on eggs, a little on soup, perhaps some over pasta. Historical recipes could be much heavier. Pepper appeared in meat dishes, sauces, pies, fish, vegetables, and even desserts. European nobles loved combining sweet and spicy flavors. To modern taste buds, some of those recipes might seem rather unusual. Imagine taking a bite of sweet fruit pie only to discover a generous amount of pepper inside. You might wonder whether someone had mixed up the recipe cards. But medieval diners considered these combinations fashionable. As trade slowly expanded over the centuries, pepper became a symbol of growing global connections. Every sack represented sailors crossing oceans, dock workers unloading ships, camel drivers crossing deserts, merchants negotiating prices, money changing hands in distant ports. One small spice connected people who would never meet one another. A farmer in India could unknowingly grow pepper that eventually seasoned a feast in a castle thousands of miles away. That is a remarkable journey for something small enough to fit inside a pepper grinder. Eventually, new sea routes changed everything. European explorers searched for faster ways to reach Asia. Kings financed dangerous expeditions because spices promised enormous profits. Finding direct routes meant avoiding many middlemen. If fewer merchants handled the pepper, perhaps prices could fall. Sometimes they did, but powerful trading companies soon built their own monopolies. They controlled shipping, they controlled supply, and quite often they controlled the price. Pepper remained valuable for centuries, although it slowly became more available as global trade expanded. Today, most of us hardly think about it. A small jar sits quietly beside the stove. When it runs low, we buy another without much thought. We shake pepper onto scrambled eggs, over roasted vegetables, into soups, across slices of pizza. Some of it probably ends up on the table instead of the food. No one gasps in horror. No one rushes to collect every grain. But if a medieval merchant could step into a modern kitchen and watch someone casually cover a plate of fries with pepper, they might stare in complete disbelief. Not because the food looked unusual, but because they were watching someone use what was once one of the world's greatest luxuries as casually as if it were ordinary dust. And in many ways, that is the quiet wonder of history. The greatest treasures of one age often become the everyday seasonings of another. In our next chapter, we will discover a spice even more astonishing than pepper. One so delicate that tens of thousands of flowers had to bloom just to fill a single small pouch. Its brilliant golden color brightened royal kitchens, emptied noble wallets, and became one of the most expensive foods the world has ever known.